My name's Christopher Herbert. I used to be the Bishop of St Albans and I retired 10 years ago. Before that I was Archdeacon of Dorking in this diocese, and before that I was Vicar of the Bourne in Farnham, where I now live. So last Sunday night I was in St Bart's where I was taking the service, and today I've been lecturing in the museum. And my title of my lecture was something like Eccentrics and Dog Collars and Detectives. Now, why did I choose that? Well, because clergy in the past, maybe not so much now, who knows, but clergy have been quite often thought of as eccentric, and I gave some examples in my talk of eccentric clergy. And to my astonishment, I mean, one of the eccentric clergy I talked about was a man called Harold Davidson, who was the rector of Stukey in Norfolk, who in the 1930s was famous for having really a rather tragic life in the end, but he'd run a mission for fallen women in London. Some of the parishioners didn't like that. And they started saying he ought to be back in the village, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he was accused of behaving immorally himself. And then he ended up by being, going back into showbiz in a very sad way. He was on Blackpool Prom for a while, and then he was in a circus, and he was mauled by a lion and died because the doctor misdiagnosed his condition. Now, the extraordinary thing about that is that sitting in the audience, totally unknown to me, was a Haslemere resident who's the grandson of that very same vicar. So that was pretty amazing. So why did I choose the subject? Well, because actually I think detective stories are fascinating. I read them endlessly. I don't like the Scandi noir ones too much. I read them, but I don't like them. I've just finished all the Icelandic detective novels by a man called Indridason. And then I've just gone back to rereading some Dorothy Sayers, who was a very fine writer back in the 1920s and 30s. And she created a character called Lord Peter Wimsey. And I mean, my favourite detective writer is a woman called Donna Leon, who writes about an Italian commissario. He's called Guido Brunetti, and he's based in Venice. So I love anything set in Italy. So Montalbano series I watch on the television, I've read all the books. And I thought it made a nice connection as a lecture between having eccentric clergy who are seen sort of slightly to one side of society, and detectives who are also slightly to one side of society. So clergy detectives are even more on one side of society. And then in my lecture I talked about the role of the clergy and how it's changed over the years, and how I suppose the Derek Nimmo type programmes in the 1960s, and more recently the Vicar of Dibley, has used clergy as a kind of slightly ho-ho scapegoat, but I think done, actually, if I'm honest, I think done much more affectionately these days than perhaps back in the 1960s, when clergy really were figures of fun. And I suppose Rev, that series, and the Grantchester series, has put a bit of sort of more focus on the life of clergy. So essentially what I was trying to do in this lecture was to link eccentricity with the clergy being slightly at an oblique angle to society, and saying detectives are the same, and let's see how the two go together. And it was a great audience. Lovely to be here.